So we often have functions to get or to set the state of an object. So in other words, if we want to make changes to the members of some object, or if we want to refer to or retrieve the value stored in that member. I'll talk about getters and setters in more detail when we talk about classes and object-oriented programming in more detail in an upcoming lesson. But in this section, I just want to give you a basic idea, just to slowly but surely get you familiar with some of the syntax. I have the vector2d struct again, and then I have the player stats, and within the player stats as a member, I have a vector2d. Again, a struct is a custom type here, so the location is the variable name, and that is of type vector2d. Now let's go and write a function. So this will be void and for example we can call it setLocation. I'll call those P and Q since we have X and Y right here. So how do we set this now? We have the location right here. This again is an object, a sub-object within this player stats. So if you instantiate that, this object right here, the location object, will be attached to that player stats object, right? So let's do. You can use the dot operator. And of course that will now allow us to set the location on that. Then let's say we want to get the location. Well, in this case the function should actually return something, right? And what should it return? Well, it should return that custom type, that vector2d. And so what is the variable that it is actually going to return? Well, of course, this location right here. That is going to be part of that instance, an instance of player stats. These two you want to have met. Location is a vector2d and the return type is a vector2d. We don't have any parameters in this case since this is a getter. Let's just remove that and let's create an object of type player stats. And I'll just call that player1. And then we'll start to get this sort of syntax again. So you have the dot operator, and then we do set location. And then often how you'll use a getter is something like this. So we create a new vector2d called vector, and we assign or initialize that here too. This, we get the location. So what does this function do? It is going to return the location. Okay, that returns a vector2d, which of course we assign to that. Okay, so these two statements should give us the same result now. Console output player1.location.x. Why again can we do location.x? Because location is a vector2d, which is a struct. How do we access a member? With the dot operator. That instance name, in this case, vector.x, right? So that's why I have these bunch of dots. So player1.location.x. And here, of course, we have this variable. So vector.x. Okay, I'll build and run that, and you'll see we get 5 printed out for each one of those. Okay, we are familiar with the dot operator at this point, so we are familiar with this sort of syntax. But I'm going to show you something that might seem a bit weird. I'll do player1.getLocation, so I'll call the getLocation function. And now I have to think, what does this getLocation function return? It returns this vector2d, right? So from this, we can do the dot operator once more, and then do x again. That will also print out 5, so we get 555 printed out. We know player1 is a struct, so we can do the dot operator, and then with that we access the members. That includes the variables and the functions But this here seems a bit weird, right? Because we do a function call and then we do dot and then x. You have to think about this function. What does it do? So this will evaluate from left to right. It will say what is player 1. Player 1 is a player stats type, which is a struct that has a member called getLocation. Alright, and that is going to return what? Vector2d, which is also a struct. Okay, and that has these two members, x and y. So this is going to evaluate what do we get back? Well, the vector2d. Okay, and from that vector2d, we can do dot x. So if you look at it like that, take it step by step, then the syntax is not that complicated. You can also something like this. I'll go and get that, and of course this is an integer. X is an integer, or is it? Actually, that's a float. I thought that was a float, so my mistake. I'll just change that to a float. So we have float f, player1.getLocation.x, and then here we can print f out. And we'll get 555 printed out. Okay, so that is going to conclude this extra demonstration for you. I just wanted to try and introduce some of the more complicated sort of syntax that you'll see that might be confusing to you if you are, again, new to programming, that you can see it's logical to follow and that it's ultimately not that complicated if you just take a step back. Now, with regards to structs, okay, so we have a struct here again. We talked about getters and setters in this lesson briefly, but the reason why you'd actually go and use those is you won't always make the members available to the programmer. So what does that mean? Well, currently we can access these members and you can also access these functions, but there are methods for controlling what you make available to the programmer. And you can use public, for example. So now these are public. And by default, the members are public, meaning that they are accessible outside of this struct. We'll talk about these keywords in more detail again in the classes lesson, but you see you have public and the colon, not a semicolon. And then whatever follows after that will be public. You also have private. Okay, so private will mean that we cannot access some of these things. So we cannot access these functions now. You'll see we get errors. These are inaccessible, and if you try and build and run this, you'll actually get errors. Cannot access private member declared in class player stats. It actually refers to the struct as a class here, and structs and classes in C++ are very similar, which is why I'm doing structs here to introduce some of these basic concepts to you. And of course you want your setters and getters to be public, and then in some instances you want your variables to be private. So your program cannot access your variables directly. You have to go and change that with a function, and that allows you to do various checks and so on. Now when it comes to structs, we typically allow the variables just to stay public, but typically when you want to use private variables and do more complex stuff, then you would use classes, which again we'll discuss later.